schools have all moved online, debate tournaments are canceled, and the national topic for Public Forum 2020 is now out. Why am I making this? I don't know. Why are you watching this? I also don't know. Perhaps you're just so much of a debate nerd that you don't even need a tournament to study for the topic, or maybe you're going to an online tournament, a digital tournament. In any case, here is the topic. Resolved. On balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the United States. As with any well-selected topic, there's no simple answer to this question. Most research articles straddle the line between pro and con, although some authors do seem a little bit biased, like they have a vendetta against charter schools or for charter schools. Charter schools are also politicized to a degree that I had no idea until I started to research them a couple days ago. Despite the fact that I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan, home of billionaire, supervillain, Trump Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. A quick note on her. Just because you're an evil person doesn't necessarily mean your ideas are bad. In truth, charter schools help disadvantaged and urban students more than they do other kids. As a 7-year teacher, my assumption is this is because a good education does wonders for a neglected intellect. While gifted, non-disadvantaged students already have had the effects of a great education, so they can't benefit from a better education in charter schools as much as someone who hasn't received a good education yet. Okay, so the presentation that I'm going to use in this video is from Prezi. There's a link to it below. If you're a teacher or coach, feel free to use this video in class as a lecture. If you're a student, feel free to follow along on Prezi. Some of the references that I give in the video are referenced in the Prezi. Anything that you don't find in the Prezi will be in the evidence pack, also listed for free below. So, once again, on balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the United States. We're first going to look at the context in which charter schools fit in terms of education in the United States. Second, we're going to look at some background and some key facts about charter schools. And then we're going to go on to pro arguments and con arguments, and I'm going to give you a chance for each argument to think of some rebuttals or to research some rebuttals for yourself. So, one more time, on balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the United States. In essence, pro says charter schools are good, con says charter schools are bad. In essence. So some context for how charter schools fit into the greater educational atmosphere of the United States. All students in America have to go to school, right? Some kind of school, but there are different options for how they can fulfill that obligation. 87% go to publicly funded schools. These are schools that are paid for with tax dollars. Of all of the students in America, 6% total, or about 3.2 million students, go to charter schools. Now this number is probably a little bit bigger now because some time has passed, a couple years since this statistic, and especially with coronavirus and the move to online school, it could be that there's been an increase in online charter school enrollments, although I don't have any evidence or proof for that. So the number for now is 3.2 million students. For reference, 10% go to private schools, 3% are homeschooled. So 6% is a fairly large chunk of the student population in America, although it definitely depends on what kind of scale you're looking at. So one major criticism of charter schools is that they are for-profit institutions. And indeed, 1 out of 6 or 15% of charter schools are for-profit or run by for-profit educational corporations. Different extremes of this would be New York State, where for-profit education companies are not allowed to run charter schools, versus Michigan, where me and Betsy DeVos are from, where 80% of all charter schools are run by for-profit companies. So the discussion around charter schools falls within the discussion of school choice, which is just the idea that parents and families should have some options about where to send their students. Vouchers are one of the more popular ways for school choice to be implemented. This is where the government gives a voucher, a coupon, a ticket to a family, and they can in turn pass it on to whatever educational institution they want to send their kid to school at, and then the government will give money to that educational institution. Now, the vast majority of vouchers in most places go to private religious schools, to private Christian schools essentially, right? And vouchers are not our topic, but there are links from charter schools to vouchers, so this may be an important part of the discussion. Magnet schools are usually specialized curriculum schools. For example, they're heavy on arts or sciences or aviation, and magnet schools draw students from across traditional boundaries. So I want to differentiate vouchers, magnet schools, charter schools, these school choice options from TPS or traditional public schools. This is what you're going to see in the evidence a lot. TPS or traditional public schools. This is where the vast majority of students in America go, something like 83%, 82% of all students. Going on to some background. Where did charter schools come from? They came from Minnesota, 1991. Charter schools can be set up by teachers' unions or by teachers or by private institutions, as you've seen before, by even some for-profit companies. So depending on the state and the laws, charter schools can be started by different groups. They've grown from 1.2 million students in 2016 to about 3.2 million now. This is a huge growth in recent years, although they've been around for something like 30 years. Supporters in general of charter schools tend to be Republican, wealthy, and so there's this political association between Republicans and charter schools, especially since Trump appointed Betsy DeVos, who's really, really big on charter schools, as his education secretary. So she's seen a lot of flack and criticism from the public and from the media, and this is a huge political association that will color the whole debate. The growth you can see in the graphs on the right. One of the graphs on the top is from Oklahoma. This is from, I believe, just one company, but the national numbers are on the bottom. It's just a pretty low-res graph, so I didn't want to blow it up too big. Some of the distributions you'll see within charter schools are an overrepresentation of minority students, of what traditionally would be known as minority students. So there's the background across the nation is 1/3 Hispanic or Latino, 1/3 white, and 1/4 black students, with Asians and Pacific Islanders and Native Americans making up the rest of the groups. 43 out of 50 states have charter schools, so not all states have charters. Washington, D.C. also has charter schools. But as you can tell by the map, there's many more charter schools in different states than in other ones. So how should you use the following arguments for pro or con? These are some kind of topic areas that I've seen the evidence coalesce around, but they're not really contention. So I wouldn't recommend that you use these arguments per se as contentions, because we need to make sure we have impact links link chains and impacts for all of these arguments if you're going to turn them in the end into a contention. So be very careful with your research and don't copy these arguments word for word, but really think about, why do these things matter? If charter schools are racist, why does that matter? If charter schools take away resources from traditional public schools, why does it matter? If charter schools help students score higher in math, does it matter? If so, why? You can also pause this video, or if you're using this Prezi in a class, you can just stop after each argument, so that students can think about potential rebuttals or arguments to each of these points. If you can't think of a good logical argument, feel free to use the evidence. There's a lot of answer twos listed in the evidence pack below. You can also do some internet research to see if you can find some counterpoint to these ideas. All right, let's get started. So before I go into pro or con into some of these arguments, I like to put myself in an emotional place where I really care about charter schools, which is a little bit boring of a topic, honestly. And so it takes a little bit of method acting to really care about charter schools in a way where you think like, wow, charter schools are amazing, or like, charter schools are horrible, they're a scourge on our country. But you need to put yourself in one of these emotional places, because if you're just reading arguments, or even just making solid logical arguments for why they're good or bad, the audience or the judge is going to feel that you don't care about the topic. And if they feel that, right, even if it's on kind of a subconscious level, they're not going to care about it as much either, right? So if we have two teams, one of whom is really making the judge feel something, and the other team who's not, the team who's doing a better job really conveying some emotions, which you first have to feel, is probably going to do better. So with that in mind, we go to pro. Charters are good. Charter schools uphold the basic American value of choice. And this choice is all important for the most disadvantaged, low SES urban populations for whom charter schools is often a godsend. So when you say that anything is wrong with charter schools from a position where you don't have to choose for your child whether to send them to a traditional public school who might be failing, or for where you feel that your child isn't getting an adequate education, and your other choice is a charter school which can totally transform the course of your child's life, like, you can't criticize charter schools unless you're in this position. Charter schools are an important choice for many, many Americans, especially for the most disadvantaged amongst us. Let's look at some of the reasons why this choice is actually quite good. First, you get a lot of bang for your buck in charter schools. Charter schools actually outperform TPS on a number of measures. Math, reading, standardized tests, according to DeAngelis et al., 2019. These results hold true despite the self-selection bias. We'll look at that in just a minute. And we also have better social outcomes. So if your child goes to a charter school, they're less likely to commit crime. They're more likely to go vote. They essentially become better citizens for having gone to charter schools. This also helps to close the achievement gap because minorities are overrepresented in charter schools. The gap between minorities and whites, essentially, or even high-low SES, can help to be, charter schools can help to close that gap because they give higher education to the people who need a better education, to the people who really need that better education. All right, with that in mind, take a moment to think of how can you answer this argument? How can you answer this contention? I'm saying that charter schools actually perform better than traditional public schools. Here's the answer that I came up with. So, charter schools do perform better than traditional public schools, but that's not because their method of education is better. It's simply because of parental involvement. So if you're the kind of parent who takes your kid out of a traditional public school and sends them to an alternative school, in this case charters, you're going to be a parent who's more involved, who cares more about education, and this is the reason why your kid is going to do better, because you as a parent are the kind of parent who really cares about what happens in their education. So some things that could vary along with that parental involvement could be how much you help them with homework, how much you read to them, how much just time you spend with them, what emphasis you put on education outside of school, different things like this. So quote from Rusakov 2020, "There is something undeniably exclusionary about it. If you don't have the resources to get your child to school by 7:30 and pick her up at 7:45, at 12:30 on Wednesdays, Success Academy, a fairly popular or very famous charter school, is not for you, literally." So only the parents who have the resources in terms of time and emotions and money, and also just the care about their child's education, these are the parents that'll send their kids to charter school and also who will do well. So this would be one answer. Next argument. So charter schools have better results, but they also use less resources than traditional public schools. They have leaner management, usually due to the fact that they have less regulations, less rules they have to follow, and they get less funding than traditional public schools. For example, they don't provide transportation, and they don't get money for building construction. So these are two areas where they just don't get funding from the state. What could be an answer to this? Here's mine. So charter schools do have less cost. They do get less funding than traditional public schools. But to quote this source, they're not more efficient relative to their cost frontier, than our traditional public schools. Essentially, there's a gap between how well could a school be doing and how they're actually doing, right? Now, charter schools do better than traditional public schools, but this gap between how well they do and how well they could be doing is bigger than that for traditional public schools, right? So charter schools could be doing a lot more for the resources and opportunities that they have versus traditional public schools, who generally operate better, right? Given their money, resources, and the position that they're in. This is kind of a complicated statistical analysis that I honestly don't understand, but go ahead, look at that piece of evidence if you're interested more. So, what do we have so far? Charters are better than traditional public schools. They provide better results for less money. And next, they actually help to improve traditional public schools. So just having a charter school around will make the local traditional public schools even better. This is because of competition. Quote, competition from charter schools is associated with modest increases in math scores from SAS 2006. So this is because if there aren't other options for schooling, there's no reason for a traditional public school to improve or to be better. If we have a charter school in that neighborhood, now we have some competition, some real reason for traditional public schools to improve. In much the same way that, let's say having like other sports teams in the area would make a sports team improve. What could be an answer to this? This one you'll probably have to go to the evidence for. Here it is. Most studies, according to Zimmer et al. 2019, most studies have shown little to no benefit from competition on TPS by charter schools. Some show a little bit of a negative effect, some a little bit of a positive effect, but all of these effects are very small, and most studies show no significant effect on competition. Next, so charter schools have better results, they do it with less money, and they actually help traditional public schools in the process. Lastly, simply the choice to choose a charter school over anything else is a good thing. Parents can more easily make choice about their children's education with charter schools. Quote, the introduction of charter schools substantially reduces the transaction cost of switching schools. This source talks about going to a bad school and whether a parent might pull their child out of a bad school or not. And what they find in this study is that if a kid goes to a bad traditional public school, a parent is not likely to pull them out, probably because the costs of switching are fairly high. How do you deal with transportation? How do you deal with their friends, with the emotional stress of leaving, with the relationship with teachers? There's a lot of reasons not to leave your school. With charter schools, parents are more likely to pull their students out if it's a bad school, so this makes the cost of switching easier. Likely, it's also true that just having more choices can be good for parents. There's a lot of reasons that might be true. Virtual charters also help disabled students and may be increasingly important during this pandemic. I see a lot of potential for a virtual charter case. The one problem is that most of the huge scandals around charter schools, or at least a lot of them, are about virtual charters. They have a deplorable track record if you look at the news anyway. So you would have to do some research and a lot of frontlining, but this could be a very promising case. An answer to this. The disadvantages on traditional public schools, which we'll look at in a second, outweigh. So parents would not have to switch from low-quality traditional public schools if we improved the low-quality traditional public schools, right? Parents shouldn't have to have alternatives. All of the schools that we send our kids to in America should be good schools. So we should focus on that instead. The choice is also limited by parental resources, so we say that they have the choice, but what if they have to go to work, right? What if they don't have a charter school around? What if they have to pay money for transportation? Like, there's a lot of reasons why their choice is actually limited by other things. And then specifically on virtual charters, virtual charters are known for abusing tax dollars with very little oversight. There's a lot that we can say on this. Just take a look at the evidence for an overview and Google virtual charters for anything else you want. All right, that is pro. Method acting. Charters are evil. Charter schools have been popularized by religious billionaires for whom charters serve two fundamental purposes. Number one, to further the school choice agenda, whose ultimate goal is to enable government money to be funneled to private religious schools, essentially taking down the separation of church and state. And second, simply to make money from the schools, as the most vocal proponents of charter schools do. Charter schools, at best, are a conspiracy, and at worst, are significantly damaging the quality of education in the United States. Let's first look at charters as businesses. So charters are often set up through management companies in order to make money. As I mentioned in the introduction, sometimes there's people behind a charity or a charter school, and then the management company that actually runs the school. People can make millions of dollars from education budgets. Please look at this Barker 2020 evidence. It's appalling. Charters also lack oversight. So whatever they're doing with this government money, nobody knows, right? There's no oversight over a lot of charter schools, so like it's very easy for them to be corrupt and to be abusing the money that we get from taxpayers. It's made even worse with online schooling, which is obviously becoming a bigger thing with the coronavirus and probably will extend into who knows how long next year, next 2 years, maybe indefinitely. Virtual schools will be much more important for education in the US. And especially with virtual charters, the lack of oversight is incredible. Like, it will be common for many students to just not show up, to not get grades, to not earn any credits, but the government still funds these students. So they still give money to these virtual charters for providing literally zero results in the end. All right, charters are just set up to make money. What's an answer to this? As I said in the intro, only 1 out of 6 charters nationwide is for profit. So the vast majority of charter schools are not made to make money. But even if they do make money, they provide better results than traditional public schools. So it seems like whatever this incentive is to make money, it's definitely worth it because we're providing better education to our students. Last, it's better to give parents the charter option in case they need it. Remember, no one is forced to go to a charter school. If it's a bad charter, or if they're not using money well, or if they're not supporting students well, parents can make up their mind whether they want to send their kids to the public school or to the charter school. They can decide by themselves. So better just give this choice. So back in the con mindset, charters are bad because they operate as a business. They're essentially corrupt organizations to make money. But even if not, they have worse results in some areas than traditional public schools. They're notorious for a few things. Number one, discipline. So charters will often expel challenging students because they don't want their record tarnished. Essentially, they have mechanisms to only accept like good students, right? So that traditional public schools can deal with difficult students, with students who are getting bad grades. They'll have kind of high standards and then just expel students or get rid of students that don't meet these standards, right? So they're not really set up to take care of the education of our communities. They're set up to maybe for, just to win awards and to be in the media, things like this. Number two, teacher turnover is really high. In fact, for teachers who teach at charter schools, they're much more likely to leave teaching as a profession overall. Lastly, on transparency, as I mentioned, charters have very little oversight, especially compared to traditional public schools, which can have a lot of criticism and a lot of oversight. All right, so there's a few areas where charters are notoriously worse than traditional public schools. What could be an answer to this? So, recalling our pro argument about academic outcomes, this is what's most important, right? If we're talking about measuring a school, we should certainly be measuring academic outcomes, right? And if we're not looking at math and reading and standardized tests where charter schools excel, we should at least look at how education affects the student, right? And in this way, charters also win out, right? They have better social outcomes for their students, like more voting and less crime. So the last thing is that given how experimental charters are, like charters are essentially set up to experiment with different educational techniques and different systems of running a school, obviously there's going to be a lot of variation in how good they are, right? But the bad ones get shut down or are reformed, but at least we learn some lessons along the way. There's certainly going to be some bad examples, right? But it's better to have this experimental system of choice rather than just only having one method of traditional public schools, which if you look at our national scores in America, you can tell are not so hot. All right. Charter schools are run as businesses. They provide bad results in several areas versus traditional public schools. But even worse, they don't just provide bad results to the students, but they actually hurt the local traditional public schools. Charter schools draw on the same financial and student resources as traditional public schools. So if the government is going to fund a student's education, they're going to give the money to whatever school the student happens to go to, whether a traditional public school or to a charter school or to a school voucher kind of a program. So 3 areas in which they hurt traditional public schools. They have negative academic effects, they hurt school funds for TPS, and they also provide TPS with less financial flexibility. Because, for example, if a charter school opens, the TPS has to deal with that decreased revenue, and they always have to be ready to deal with that decreased revenue if some local charter happens to open up. On the flip side, if a charter gets closed down, as they often do because they often underperform, the TPS also has to be ready to absorb all of those students, right? To provide good education to all of these students. So because their buffer window has to be so big to account for opening and closing of charter school, TPS have less flexibility to operate financially. All right, how can we answer this? Let's take a look. First, although it varies by state, charters receive 30% less funding per student than TPS. So to say that we're taking money, that charters are taking money away from TPS is absurd. Charters get better results for less money than TPS. Charters are much more efficient than TPS, actually. Secondly, because charters offer TPS some kind of competition, it could be that the administrators or management of TPS don't like this competition, right? And it could be an argument for why they feel like they're hurting or they don't have flexibility or whatever. But like ultimately, we should be looking at how can we help students the most, right? We shouldn't be worrying about our budgets or our tax or how we feel about management or if the job becomes difficult. How can we actually help our students? And that we see charters, number one, doing much better at, and number two, helping TPS also to improve through competition. All right. Charters are bad. They operate as businesses to make money. They have worse results than TPS in some areas. They hurt TPS, even the bad results aside. Lastly, this is a really big one that I've kind of shoved under one bubble, but this could really be several bubbles. This could be a couple different contentions, actually. Charters are racist and they're also biased. So they lead to racial and economic segregation for a couple different reasons. Essentially, if there's a charter school, despite the actual results, they're famous for like being good or being good alternatives. A lot of parents want to send their kids to charter schools, so the property values in the area will increase, right? And this means that the people who can send their kids to these local charter schools are only the people who can afford these the rent or housing prices in the area, right? So this will naturally lead to economic segregation, as the people around charter schools are richer people, the ones who live further away are poorer people, essentially. In terms of racism, this is a great article from Lad 19 and Sandel et al. 2019. I don't have the full article for either one, I believe, but I think if your school has some kind of a library access, it would be really worth looking into these articles. Quote, charter schools often counter the public interest by increasing the racial segregation of students. This is because blacks tend to go to more black charter schools, whites tend to go to more white charter schools compared to their local TPS, what the demographics would be at their local TPS. Second, this one especially, racism is apparent in hiring and discipline. Sandel et al. Has a really scathing critique of charter schools in this article that I think would be awesome for you to look into if you want to make a contention or a whole case based on this. Second bias, real estate around charters, as I said, tends to be more expensive, so this creates a high SES bias. Okay, how can we answer this? So, charters have to pick students by lottery. Only applicants can be biased. What this means is if charters have too many applicants, they have to randomly pick who gets to enter, right? So if you have a random selection, there's no way that can be biased unless the people applying are biased, right? Like if all blacks apply to a place or all whites apply to a place, yeah, you're gonna have some bias, but that's because of the applicants. You can't blame that on charter schools. Second, on the high SES bias, there's an inevitable consequence of charters doing a good job, is that yes, of course people want to go there, of course people want to move there, of course the area around will be more expensive. That's because charters are awesome, right? If they're doing a good job, clearly people will want to send their kids there, and clearly that's going to drive competition for real estate. Like, it's kind of unfortunate that it can lead to this stratification, but it's just a sign that charters are doing really well, right? Depending on how the Khan team phrases this argument, this can really be a turn. Like, yeah, charters are doing great. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. That's it. Charters are awful. What's not awful is hitting the like button. You've made it to the end of the video. Hit the like button. Hit it. Hit it. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, especially on the case, you have any kind of rebuttals or questions about how to phrase things or suggestions of things to add, just comment below. It'll help the community out a lot. Take a look at the resources, also linked in the video below, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.